In the heart of Arizona, where the desert sun beats down mercilessly on the red earth and ancient cacti stand like silent sentinels, there lived a woman whose story would challenge everything a small town thought they knew about love, loss, and the strength of the human spirit. This is not just another tale of heartbreak. This is the story of Maria Santos, a woman whose towering 6'3" frame made her a target of cruel whispers, and whose 7 devastating losses nearly broke her completely. But sometimes, when we least expect it, love finds us in the most unexpected forms, through the most unexpected people. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and gossip traveled faster than tumbleweeds in a desert storm. Maria Santos walked down Main Street, her head held high despite the weight of 7 years of unbearable grief pressing down on her shoulders like the oppressive desert heat. At 34, she stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, her presence impossible to ignore, her pain equally impossible to hide. "There goes the giant again," whispered Mrs. Henderson from behind her grocery store window, her voice dripping with the kind of cruelty that small towns sometimes breed like wildfire. 7 babies, can you believe it? Maybe God's trying to tell her something. The words cut through Maria like shards of broken glass, each syllable a reminder of the empty nursery at home, the unused cribs gathering dust, the dreams that had died 7 times over. She quickened her pace, her worn boots clicking against the cracked pavement, trying to outrun the whispers that followed her like hungry vultures circling overhead. Maria had moved to Copper Ridge 8 years ago with her husband David, both of them young and full of hope, ready to start their family in this quiet desert town. David had been everything she thought she wanted: charming, ambitious, successful in his real estate business. But when the losses began, when baby after baby slipped away from them in those crucial early months, David's love had proven as fragile as morning frost in the desert. "I can't do this anymore, Maria," he had said just 6 months ago, his bags already packed, his wedding ring sitting cold and abandoned on the kitchen counter. "This isn't what I signed up for. You're broken, and I can't fix you." Broken. The word echoed in her mind as she pushed open the door to Rosie's diner, the little bell above jingling like a funeral dirge. The conversations inside died instantly, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable silence that makes your skin crawl. Maria had learned to navigate these moments, to pretend she didn't notice the stares, the way people suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating when she walked by. "The usual, honey?" asked Rosie, the 60-something owner whose weathered face showed more kindness than most in this town. Rosie had lost her own husband in Vietnam and understood something about carrying invisible wounds. "Just coffee today, thanks," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She slid into the corner booth, the same one she'd occupied every Tuesday morning for the past year, ever since David left. It was her ritual, her small act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to make her disappear. The diner buzzed with the usual morning crowd, ranchers discussing cattle prices, retirees solving the world's problems over eggs and bacon, young mothers juggling toddlers and coffee cups. Maria watched them all, these people living their normal lives, and felt like an alien observing a species she could never truly belong to. "Heard, she's seeing that therapist in Phoenix now," came another whisper from the booth behind her. "Waste of money if you ask me. Some people just aren't meant to be mothers." Maria's coffee cup trembled in her hands. 7 pregnancies, 7 losses. Each one had taken a piece of her soul, carved away another chunk of her hope until she felt hollow inside, like one of those ancient cliff dwellings scattered throughout Arizona. Once full of life, now empty ruins weathered by time and abandonment. The first loss had been at 12 weeks. They'd been so excited, had already picked out names, started planning the nursery. When the bleeding started, David had held her in the hospital, both of them crying, both of them believing it was just bad luck, that next time would be different. But next time wasn't different. Neither was the time after that or the one after that. With each loss, David grew more distant, more frustrated, more convinced that Maria was somehow defective. The doctors ran test after test, found nothing conclusively wrong, offered platitudes about "these things happen" and "keep trying." And by the seventh loss, David was already emotionally gone. He'd started working late, taking business trips that seemed suspiciously frequent, coming home with the smell of perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts. When she confronted him, he'd exploded with a rage that revealed the depth of his resentment. "Look at yourself, Maria. You're a giant freak who can't even do the one thing women are supposed to do naturally. I'm tired of pretending this is normal, tired of pretending you're normal." Those words had shattered something inside her that went deeper than grief, deeper than loss. They'd attacked the very core of who she was, made her question whether she deserved love, whether she deserved anything good at all. Now, sitting in Rosie's diner with the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her, Maria felt that familiar darkness creeping in around the edges of her vision. The depression that had become her constant companion whispered its familiar lies. "You're too big, too broken, too much. No one could ever love someone like you." The bell above the door chimed again, and Maria looked up to see a figure that seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall, though not as tall as her, with weathered bronze skin that spoke of generations under the southwestern sun, and long black hair streaked with silver that he wore pulled back in a simple ponytail. His clothes were simple: worn jeans, a faded flannel shirt, boots that had seen countless miles of desert terrain. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Dark as obsidian, they held a depth of understanding that seemed to see straight through to her soul. This was Thomas Crow Feather, though Maria didn't know his name yet. What she did know, with a certainty that surprised her, was that this man had known loss too. It was written in the lines around his eyes, in the careful way he moved, as if he carried invisible wounds that had taught him to be gentle with the world. Thomas had indeed known loss. At 52, he was a widower who had loved his wife Sarah with the kind of devotion that poets write about. They'd been married for 23 years when cancer took her, a slow and brutal thief that stole her piece by piece until only memories remained. They'd never had children, not by choice, but because life had other plans. Sarah had miscarried twice in their early years together, and they'd eventually made peace with being a family of two. But watching his beloved wife waste away, holding her hand as she took her last breath, had left Thomas with his own understanding of what it meant to be broken, to question whether love was worth the inevitable pain it brought. He'd moved to Copper Ridge 2 years ago, seeking solitude in the desert, working as a handyman and carpenter, living simply in a small adobe house on the outskirts of town. The Apache reservation where he'd grown up was only an hour's drive away, but it felt like a different world from this predominantly white town where he was often the only native face in any given room. Thomas had noticed Maria before, of course. In a town this small, everyone noticed everyone, but he'd seen beyond the whispers and stares to something else. A woman carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear alone. He'd heard the cruel comments, seen the way people treated her like a curiosity rather than a human being, and it had stirred something protective in his chest. As he approached the counter to order his coffee, he couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the table near Maria's booth. "I heard she's thinking about trying again," one woman was saying, her voice loud enough to ensure Maria could hear every word. "Can you imagine? After 7 failures, some people just don't know when to quit." "It's unnatural," her companion agreed. "A woman that size, it's like God was sending a message. Maybe she should focus on finding a nice hobby instead of trying to play house." Thomas felt his jaw clench. In his Apache culture, children were considered sacred gifts, and the loss of a child was mourned by the entire community. The idea of mocking someone for such losses was not just cruel, it was spiritually wrong, a violation of the natural order that demanded compassion in the face of suffering. He turned from the counter, his coffee forgotten, and walked directly to Maria's booth. She looked up in surprise as his shadow fell across her table, her green eyes wide with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to choose his words carefully. "I'm Thomas. I couldn't help but overhear those women, and I wanted to say something if you don't mind." Maria's first instinct was to shrink away, to mumble something polite and escape before this stranger could add his own judgment to the pile she already carried. But something in his eyes stopped her, a gentleness that she hadn't seen directed at her in longer than she could remember. Okay, she managed, gesturing to the seat across from her with a trembling hand. Thomas slid into the booth, his movements deliberate and respectful, as if he understood that she was like a wounded animal who might bolt at any sudden movement. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken understanding passing between them like a current. "In my culture," Thomas began, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "we believe that some souls are chosen to carry heavier burdens because they have the strength to bear them, not because they're being punished, but because they're being prepared for something greater." Maria's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever suggested that her losses might be anything other than failures, defects, evidence of her inadequacy as a woman. "I don't feel strong," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the diner's ambient noise. "I feel broken, empty, like there's something fundamentally wrong with me." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "My wife and I lost 2 babies early in our marriage. Each time, I wondered what we had done wrong, what the spirits were trying to tell us. It took me years to understand that sometimes loss isn't about punishment or failure. Sometimes it's about preparing our hearts for a different kind of love." The words hit Maria like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they offered something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope that had driven her through 7 pregnancies, but something deeper, more sustainable. "Sarah, my wife, she used to say that love comes in many forms," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the reverent tone people use when speaking of the beloved dead. "She said that some people are meant to love through biology, others through choice, through action, through simply being present for those who need them most." "Your wife sounds like she was wise," Maria said, surprised to find her voice steadier than it had been in months. She was. "Cancer took her 3 years ago, and I thought that was the end of love for me. Thought I was too old, too set in my ways, too damaged by loss to ever open my heart again." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "But lately I've been thinking she might have been wrong about that." The implication hung in the air between them like morning mist, delicate and shimmering with possibility. Maria felt something stir in her chest. Not the desperate hunger for validation that had characterized her relationship with David, but something quieter, more profound. "I should probably tell you," she said, her voice gaining strength, "that I'm not exactly what most people would call a catch. I'm too tall, too broken, too much baggage for anyone to want to deal with." Thomas smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen directed at her in longer than she could remember. It transformed his entire face, revealing laugh lines that spoke of a man who had known joy despite his losses. "Maria," he said, and hearing her name spoken with such gentle reverence made her heart skip a beat. "I've been watching you for months, seeing how you carry yourself with dignity despite everything this town puts you through. You walk through their cruelty with your head high, you treat everyone with kindness, even when they don't deserve it, and you keep going, even when everything inside you must be screaming to give up. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. You've been watching me? She asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. Hard not to notice the most beautiful woman in town, he replied simply, as if stating an obvious fact rather than offering a compliment. Beautiful. When was the last time anyone had called her beautiful? David had stopped using that word years ago, replacing it with criticisms about her height, her inability to conceive, her growing depression. The women in town whispered about her being a giant or a freak. But this man, this stranger with kind eyes and gentle hands, saw beauty where others saw only failure. "I'm 6'3", she said, as if this might change his mind. "I noticed. I'm 6'1". So what? Most men don't like women who are taller than them. Most men are insecure boys pretending to be grown-ups, Thomas replied with a slight shrug. A real man isn't threatened by a woman's height, her strength, or her past. A real man sees those things as gifts. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Rosie, who had been watching the exchange with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize something special when it was happening. "You two want some pie?" she asked, though her tone suggested it was more of a statement than a question. "Got fresh apple, and it pairs real nice with deep conversations." "I should probably go," Maria said, suddenly overwhelmed by the intensity of what was happening. This was too much, too fast, too good to be real. "Stay," Thomas said quietly. "Please, let me buy you pie and tell you about the house I'm building." "You're building a house? Adobe, traditional style, about 10 miles out of town. It's going to have a big kitchen with windows facing east to catch the sunrise, a garden where someone could grow vegetables or flowers or whatever makes them happy, and a porch where two people could sit in the evenings and watch the stars come out." The picture he painted was so vivid, so full of quiet domestic happiness, that Maria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It sounded like everything she'd dreamed of during those long, lonely nights after David left. "That sounds beautiful," she managed. "It will be, when it's finished. But it's going to be too big for just one person. Too quiet. Houses like that are meant to be filled with love, with laughter, with the kind of life that two people build together." The implication was clear, and Maria felt her heart racing. This couldn't be happening. Men like Thomas, kind, stable, emotionally mature men, didn't fall for women like her. There had to be a catch, some hidden agenda, some cruel joke waiting to be revealed. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw only sincerity, only the kind of patient hope that comes from someone who has learned to value genuine connection over superficial attraction. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You don't even know me. You don't know about all the ways I'm broken, all the reasons why David left, all the reasons why I'm not worth the trouble." Thomas reached across the table then, his weathered hand covering hers with surprising gentleness. His skin was warm, calloused from years of honest work, and Maria realized it had been months since anyone had touched her with kindness. "I know that you've survived 7 losses that would have destroyed most people. I know that you face this town's cruelty every day and still choose kindness. I know that you're strong enough to keep going when everything inside you wants to quit. And I know that when you smile, really smile, not the polite mask you wear for everyone else, it lights up your whole face like sunrise over the desert." "When have you seen me really smile?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Last month, when old Mr. Peterson's dog got loose and you spent 2 hours helping him look for it. When you found that little terrier hiding under Mrs. Garcia's porch, the relief and joy on your face was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." The fact that he had noticed such a small moment, had found beauty in her compassion for an elderly man and his lost pet, made something crack open inside Maria's chest. For so long she had felt invisible except when people wanted to mock her. The idea that someone had been seeing her acts of kindness, her moments of genuine emotion, was almost too much to process. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need you to understand something. I may never be able to give you children. The doctors don't know why I keep losing them, but after 7 times, I can't put myself through that again. And I can't put someone else through it either. And Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Maria, I'm 52 years old. I've already raised the children I was meant to raise. My nephew after his parents died, my wife's sister's kids when she went through her divorce. I've coached Little League, taught kids how to fish, walked my niece down the aisle at her wedding. If the spirits bless us with children of our own, that would be a gift. But if they don't, that doesn't make our love any less valuable, any less real. But what if I can't even try again? What if I'm too scared, too broken by all the losses? Then we don't try. We love each other exactly as we are, exactly where we are. We build a life based on what we can give each other, not on what we think we're supposed to want. The simplicity of it, the acceptance, was so foreign to Maria's experience that she almost couldn't comprehend it. David had made their entire relationship contingent on her ability to produce children. Every month that passed without a pregnancy had been seen as a failure, every loss a reason to question their future together. But Thomas was offering something different. Love without conditions, acceptance without requirements, a future built on who they were rather than what they could produce. I'm scared, she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I'm scared that this is too good to be true, that you'll change your mind when you really get to know me, that I'll disappoint you the way I disappointed David. David was a fool, Thomas said with quiet conviction. Any man who would abandon a woman like you because of something completely beyond your control doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you, let alone share your bed or your heart. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Maria's breath catch. When was the last time someone had defended her, had been angry on her behalf, rather than at her? You barely know me, she protested weakly. I know enough. I know that you volunteer at the animal shelter on weekends, that you always tip Rosie extra, even though you're living on a tight budget, that you sent flowers to Mrs. Henderson when her husband died, even though she's never been kind to you. I know that you have a good heart, Maria Santos, and that's more important than anything else. The fact that he had been paying such close attention, that he had seen her small acts of kindness and found them worthy of notice, made Maria feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. David had been so focused on what she couldn't do that he'd stopped noticing what she could do, what she did do every day to make the world a little bit better. How do you know all of this? She asked. Small town. People talk. But more than that, I've been hoping for the courage to approach you for months. When you're interested in someone, you pay attention. Months. Since the day I saw you helping Mrs. Garcia carry her groceries to her car during that windstorm last spring. You were struggling against the wind, your hair whipping around your face, but you wouldn't let that elderly woman carry those heavy bags alone. That's when I knew. Knew what? That you were the kind of woman worth building a life with. The words hung between them like a promise, like a bridge spanning the chasm of loneliness that had defined Maria's existence for so long. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the possibility he was offering, but the voices of doubt were loud in her head. What if he was just feeling sorry for her? What if this was some kind of misguided rescue fantasy? What if he realized later that she really was too broken, too much work, too complicated for a simple life in the desert? But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that quieted those doubts. Not the desperate intensity of someone trying to fix a broken thing, but the steady warmth of someone who had found something precious and wanted to protect it. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. I don't know how to trust again, how to hope again. David left me feeling like I was fundamentally unlovable. We'll figure it out together, Thomas replied. No pressure, No timeline, no expectations except honesty and kindness. We'll take it one day at a time, one conversation at a time. And if I have bad days, if the grief comes back, if I can't stop thinking about the babies I lost, then I'll sit with you in the grief. I'll hold you while you cry, or give you space if that's what you need. I'll remind you that loving and losing doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. The offer was so simple, so free of conditions and demands, that Maria felt something inside her chest begin to unfurl, like a flower that had been closed tight against the harsh desert sun. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by loss, a life that wasn't built around what was missing, but around what was possible. "Okay," she said, the word barely audible, but carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. "Okay? Okay, let's try. Let's see what happens when two broken people decide to be broken together instead of alone." Thomas smiled then, a smile so bright and genuine that it transformed his entire face, and Maria realized that maybe, just maybe, she was about to discover what it felt like to be loved for exactly who she was, scars and all. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maria Santos felt like she might actually deserve the light. 3 months had passed since that first conversation in Rosie's diner, and the desert around Copper Ridge had transformed from the harsh browns of late summer to the subtle golds and purples of autumn. Maria found herself changing too, in ways both small and profound, like a plant that had been moved from shadow into sunlight and was slowly remembering how to bloom. She stood now in the doorway of Thomas's half-finished adobe house, watching him work on the kitchen cabinets with the patient precision of someone who understood that the best things in life couldn't be rushed. His shirt was damp with honest sweat, his hair pulled back with a leather tie, and there was something deeply satisfying about watching a man create something beautiful with his own hands. "You're staring," he said without looking up from his work, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "I'm admiring," she corrected, stepping into what would soon be the kitchen. "There's a difference." "Is there now?" Thomas set down his sandpaper and turned to face her, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "And what exactly are you admiring?" "The craftsmanship," Maria replied primly, though her eyes were definitely not focused on the cabinets. "The attention to detail. The way you measure twice and cut once." "Uh-huh." Thomas crossed the small space between them in 3 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with the gentle reverence that still surprised her after all these weeks. "And here, I thought you might be admiring something else entirely." "Well," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as he leaned closer, "maybe the craftsman is worth admiring too." Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, like the house Thomas was building, each step deliberate and sure, each new level of intimacy earned through patience and trust. They had spent countless evenings talking on his temporary porch, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Maria had told him about each of her losses, the way hope had died a little more with each one, and Thomas had listened without trying to fix or minimize her pain. In return, he had shared his own grief. The slow agony of watching Sarah waste away, the guilt he felt for sometimes being relieved when her suffering finally ended, the years of numbness that had followed. They were both wounded healers, learning to tend each other's scars while their own slowly mended. "Maria," Thomas said now, his forehead resting against hers, "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. This was it, she thought. This was when he would tell her he'd changed his mind, that she was too much work, that he'd realized he couldn't handle her baggage after all. "Okay," she managed, bracing herself for the blow. "I love you." The words hit her like a physical shock, not because they were unexpected. She had seen love growing in his eyes for weeks now, but because they were offered so simply, so freely, without conditions or caveats or demands for reciprocation. "Thomas," she began, but he placed a gentle finger against her lips. "You don't have to say it back. I'm not telling you because I need to hear it in return. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I want you to know that you are loved, completely and unconditionally, exactly as you are." Tears sprang to Maria's eyes. But for once they weren't tears of grief or frustration. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a joy so pure it felt almost too bright to contain. "I love you too," she whispered against his finger. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid to believe it, but I do. I love you so much it scares me." Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her against his chest where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heart. And Maria marveled at how perfectly she fit against him despite their height difference. With David, she had always felt too big, too much, like she was taking up more space than she deserved. But with Thomas, she felt exactly the right size, like she had been made to fit in this particular embrace. "What are you scared of?" he asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "That this is too good to be true. That something will happen to take it away, that I'll mess it up somehow." "Maria, look at me." She pulled back to meet his eyes, seeing nothing but love and certainty reflected there. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not David, and this isn't that kind of love. This is the kind that weathers storms, that grows stronger under pressure, that chooses to stay even when things get difficult." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've already seen you at your worst, and it only made me love you more. I've seen you cry over babies that never were. I've watched you struggle with depression. I've been there when the grief hits you like a wave and knocks you off your feet. And every single time, I've thought the same thing. This woman is incredible. This woman is worth everything." The conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty, was like a balm to wounds Maria hadn't even realized were still bleeding. For so long, she had believed that love was conditional, that it had to be earned through perfection, through meeting someone else's expectations. But Thomas was offering something different. Love as a gift freely given, not a prize to be won. "I want to show you something," Thomas said, taking her hand and leading her toward the back of the house. They walked through what would soon be the living room, past the stone fireplace he had built with his own hands, to a door that opened onto a covered patio. But it wasn't the patio that took Maria's breath away. It was the garden beyond it. Where once there had been only desert scrub, Thomas had created something magical. Raised beds filled with rich, dark soil stretched across the space, already planted with winter vegetables that were thriving in the mild Arizona autumn. There were tomato plants heavy with fruit, rows of lettuce and spinach, herbs that filled the air with their fragrance. "Thomas, this is beautiful," Maria breathed, stepping into the garden space. "When did you do all this?" "I've been working on it in the evenings after you go home. I wanted it to be a surprise." He moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "I know how much you love growing things. I thought maybe this could be our garden. Our place to create life together, even if it's not the kind of life we originally planned." The symbolism wasn't lost on her. After years of her body failing to nurture the life she desperately wanted to create, here was a different kind of creation, a different way to bring forth beauty and sustenance and growth. It was Thomas's way of saying that there were many ways to be fertile, many ways to be fruitful, many ways to leave a legacy of love. "Our garden," she repeated, the words tasting like hope on her tongue. "If you want it to be, if you want to build this life with me." Maria turned to face him fully, this man who had seen her at her most broken and chosen to love her anyway, who had taken her pain and transformed it into possibility, who had looked at her supposed failures and seen only strength. "Yes," she said, the word carrying the weight of every dream she'd thought she'd lost, every hope she'd thought was dead. "Yes, I want to build this life with you." Thomas kissed her then, soft and sweet, under the desert stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Maria felt something shift inside her chest, not the desperate hunger for what she couldn't have, but a deep contentment with what she could have, what she was choosing to have. They spent the next hour walking through the garden, Thomas explaining his plans for each section, Maria adding her own ideas and suggestions. They talked about expanding the herb garden, maybe adding some fruit trees, possibly even keeping chickens someday. It was the kind of conversation that couples have when they're planning a future together, when they're building something that will outlast both of them. "There's something else I want to show you," Thomas said as they made their way back toward the house. He led her to a room she hadn't seen before, one that had been closed off during her previous visits. When he opened the door and flicked on the light, Maria gasped. It was a workshop, but not just any workshop. It was filled with the most beautiful wooden furniture she had ever seen. Chairs and tables, cabinets and shelves, all crafted with the same patient attention to detail that Thomas brought to everything he did. "You made all of this?" she asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a dining table that seemed to glow with inner warmth. "It's what I do when I can't sleep, when my hands need to stay busy. Sarah used to say I thought with my hands as much as my head." He picked up a small wooden box from the workbench, turning it over in his palms. "I've been working on something special, something I wasn't sure I'd ever have the courage to give to anyone." He handed her the box, and Maria's breath caught when she saw what was carved into the lid. 2 birds in flight, their wings intertwined, soaring together against a backdrop of desert sky and mountains. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every feather detailed, every curve perfect. "Thomas, this is incredible," she whispered, afraid to open it. "Look inside." With trembling fingers, Maria lifted the lid. Nestled in a bed of soft velvet was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't a traditional diamond engagement ring, but something far more meaningful, a band of silver inlaid with turquoise and coral, the stones arranged in a pattern that seemed to flow like water, like wind, like the very essence of the desert they both loved. "It's a traditional Apache design," Thomas explained, his voice soft with emotion. "The turquoise represents the sky, infinite and eternal. The coral represents the earth, grounding and stable. Together, they symbolize the balance between dreams and reality, between the spiritual and the physical." Maria stared at the ring, overwhelmed by its beauty and by what it represented. This wasn't just a proposal, it was a promise. A commitment to building something together that honored both of their cultures, both of their histories. "Maria Santos," Thomas said, taking the ring from the box and dropping to one knee right there in his workshop, surrounded by the beautiful things his hands had created. "Will you marry me? Will you help me finish this house, tend this garden, build this life? Will you let me love you for the rest of my days?" The tears came then, unstoppable and cleansing, washing away years of pain and self-doubt and fear. Through her tears, Maria saw not just Thomas kneeling before her, but a future stretching out like the desert horizon, vast and beautiful and full of possibility. "Yes," she sobbed, holding out her trembling hand. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, which she realized it had been. Thomas had crafted it specifically for her hand, her life, her heart. As he stood and pulled her into his arms, Maria felt the last of her walls crumble, the last of her defenses fall away. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered against his chest. "Believe it," Thomas murmured into her hair. "Believe in us. Believe in love that doesn't require you to be anything other than exactly who you are." Dree. They held each other in the workshop, surrounded by the evidence of Thomas's skill and patience and love, and Maria finally understood what it meant to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. not for what she could produce or provide, but for who she was at her core. A woman with a generous heart, a strong spirit, and the courage to keep loving even after love had broken her. The next morning, Maria woke up in her own apartment, but with a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of her place in the world. She looked at the ring on her finger, their ring, their promise, and felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had errands to run in town, and for the first time in years she wasn't dreading the whispers and stares. Let them talk, she thought. Let them judge. She knew who she was now, knew what she was worth, and their opinions couldn't touch that knowledge. At the grocery store, she ran into Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had made so many cruel comments about her losses. Instead of avoiding her as she usually did, Maria walked right up to her with her head held high. "Mrs. Henderson," she said pleasantly, "how are you doing today?" The older woman looked startled, clearly not expecting such a direct approach. "Oh, Maria, I'm fine, dear. How are you?" "I'm wonderful, actually. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me?" Mrs. Henderson looked genuinely confused. "For helping me realize that other people's opinions about my life don't actually matter. Your comments about my losses, about my worth as a woman, they hurt for a while, but they also helped me understand that anyone who would mock someone's grief isn't someone whose opinion I should value." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red, and she looked around nervously as other shoppers began to pay attention to their conversation. "I never meant," she began, but Maria held up a hand. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is that I'm done letting people like you make me feel small. I'm done apologizing for taking up space in this world. I'm done hiding from people who think my pain is entertainment." Maria's voice had grown stronger with each word, and she realized that other people in the store had stopped their shopping to listen. Good, she thought. Let them hear this. "I've found someone who loves me exactly as I am," she continued, holding up her left hand so the ring caught the fluorescent light. "Someone who sees my losses not as failures, but as evidence of how much love I have to give. Someone who understands that a woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children." Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly unprepared for this level of directness. "I hope someday you find the kind of love that makes you want to build people up instead of tearing them down," Maria said, her voice gentle now, but still firm. "I hope you learn that cruelty says more about the person giving it than the person receiving it." With that, Maria turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Henderson standing speechless in the cereal aisle. As she continued her shopping, Maria noticed something different in the way people looked at her. Some still stared, but there was a new quality to their attention, respect perhaps, or at least a recognition that she was not someone to be trifled with. At the checkout, the young cashier, a girl Maria had seen around town but never spoken to, looked at her ring with obvious admiration. "That's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen," she said shyly. "Thank you," Maria replied with a genuine smile. "My fiancé made it himself." "He made it. Wow. He must really love you." "He does. And I love him. Sometimes that's all that matters." The girl smiled back, and Maria realized that maybe, just maybe, her story could be an inspiration rather than a cautionary tale. Maybe there were other women in this town who needed to see that love could come in unexpected forms, that worth wasn't determined by conventional measures of success. That evening, Maria drove out to Thomas's house, their house, she corrected herself, to find him waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that made her heart sing. "How did it go in town today?" he asked as she settled beside him on the wooden bench he had built. "Different," she said, leaning into his warmth. "I stood up to Mrs. Henderson." "Good for you." "What did you say?" Maria recounted the conversation, and Thomas listened with the kind of attention that made her feel heard, valued, important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, processing what she had shared. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. "That took courage. I felt different today, stronger, like I finally understood that their opinions don't define me. They never did, but I'm glad you can see that now." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Maria thought about how much her life had changed in just a few months, how love had transformed not just her circumstances, but her very understanding of herself. "Thomas," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you ever wish things were different? Do you ever wish I could give you children?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Maria began to worry she had asked the wrong question, pushed too hard into territory that was better left unexplored. But when he finally spoke, his words were measured and thoughtful. "I would be lying if I said I never think about it," he said. "Not because I need children to be happy, but because I see how much you wanted them, how much that loss still hurts you sometimes. If I could take that pain away, give you that experience, I would do it in a heartbeat." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for a man who could acknowledge the complexity of their situation without making her feel guilty or inadequate. "But," Thomas continued, "I need you to understand something. The life we're building together, the love we share, the family we're creating, it's not a consolation prize. It's not second best. It's exactly what I want, exactly what I choose, exactly what makes me happy." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've learned the difference between what I thought I wanted and what actually makes me happy. I thought I wanted a traditional life with Sarah, kids, grandkids, the whole conventional package. But what made me happiest was simply being with her, building a life together, facing whatever came our way as a team." He turned to face her fully, his hands capturing hers. "Maria, you are not a compromise. You are not a settlement. You are the woman I choose, the life I want, the future I'm excited to build. If children come to us somehow, through adoption, through fostering, through the kids in our community who need extra love, that will be wonderful. But if they don't, that won't make our life any less full, any less meaningful, any less beautiful." The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, finally quieted the last whispers of doubt in Maria's mind. This was real. This was lasting. This was the kind of love that could weather any storm. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." As the stars began to appear in the vast desert sky, Maria felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. She was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the right life. It wasn't the life she had originally planned, but it was better, deeper, richer, more authentic than anything she could have imagined. The woman who had been mocked for her losses, ridiculed for her height, abandoned by her husband, had found something more precious than gold in the desert. She had found a love that saw her not as broken, but as beautiful, not as lacking, but as complete, not as too much, but as exactly enough. And in the morning they would continue building their house, tending their garden, creating their life together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. The desert would bloom around them, as it always did for those patient enough to wait for the right season, wise enough to recognize beauty in unexpected forms, brave enough to believe that love, real love, was always worth the risk. In Copper Ridge, Arizona, where the gossips had once whispered about the giant woman who couldn't keep her babies, they would soon be talking about something else entirely, the most beautiful love story their small town had ever seen. Proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, and that love, true love, really can conquer all. Hey, my friends. Help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers. even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.